The morning of May 8th, 1942 began like any other day in the Coral Sea. The sun broke through scattered clouds, painting the vast Pacific waters in shades of gold and turquoise. Aboard the USS Lexington, a fleet aircraft carrier displacing over 40,000 tons, more than 2,500 sailors went about their duties with practiced efficiency. Some worked in the engine rooms deep below the waterline. Others manned anti-aircraft guns, positioned strategically across the massive deck. The ship's radar operators sat in their dimly lit compartments, eyes fixed on glowing screens that showed nothing but open ocean for miles in every direction. But in just 7 minutes, everything would change. 27 Japanese Val dive bombers were already in the air, their engines humming as they approached from the north. What happened next would become one of the most intense aerial battles in naval history, a confrontation so swift and devastating that it would force American military strategists to completely rethink how carrier warfare would be conducted for the remainder of World War II. If you're fascinated by real stories of courage and tactical evolution in military history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you carefully researched historical narratives that reveal the human experiences behind pivotal moments in warfare. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon stood on the bridge of the Lexington, binoculars pressed against his eyes as he scanned the horizon. The 41-year-old officer from Portland, Oregon had served in the Navy for nearly 2 decades, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the vulnerability he felt that morning. Intelligence reports had confirmed that Japanese forces were operating in the area, likely searching for American carriers after the Battle of the Coral Sea had begun just days earlier. Dixon knew that the Lexington, nicknamed Lady Lex by her crew, was a prime target. At 888 feet long and with a flight deck that could accommodate over 90 aircraft, she was impossible to hide and extremely difficult to maneuver quickly. The ship's captain, Frederick Sherman, had positioned the Lexington alongside her sister carrier, the USS Yorktown, creating a defensive formation that allowed both vessels to provide mutual support. Around them, a screen of cruisers and destroyers formed a protective ring, their crews at battle stations since dawn. The morning air felt heavy with anticipation, thick with the salt spray that constantly washed across the deck. Sailors not actively engaged in combat operations lingered near their stations, smoking cigarettes and making nervous jokes to ease the tension that had become their constant companion since entering these contested waters. In the radar room, 23-year-old Seaman First Class Thomas Morelli from Brooklyn, New York, watched his screen with intense concentration. The son of Italian immigrants who ran a small bakery in Bensonhurst, Morelli had joined the Navy 2 years earlier, seeking adventure and a steady paycheck during the Depression. Now, as he monitored the radar returns, he understood that his job could mean the difference between life and death for everyone aboard. The technology was still relatively new, and reading the green phosphorescent display required skill and experience that Morelli was still developing. When the first blips appeared on his screen at 11:23 in the morning, he initially thought they might be American aircraft returning from patrol, but as the contacts grew stronger and more numerous, moving at high speed directly toward the carrier group, Morelli's stomach tightened. He reached for the communication handset with a trembling hand, his Brooklyn accent thick with urgency as he reported to the bridge. Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 350, range approximately 40 miles and closing fast. Count shows at least 24 contacts, maybe more. On the bridge, Dixon received the report and immediately ordered general quarters. The ship's alarm system erupted in a cacophony of bells and horns that sent men running to their battle stations throughout the massive vessel. Gun crews scrambled to their positions, loading ammunition and training their weapons skyward. In the hangar deck below, aircraft mechanics secured loose equipment and prepared firefighting gear, knowing that if enemy bombs penetrated the flight deck, the tightly packed planes and aviation fuel would create an inferno. The entire ship transformed from a floating city into a fortress in less than 3 minutes, every man focused on his specific role in the defense of their home. Captain Sherman ordered the Lexington to increase speed to 30 knots, the maximum the aging carrier could manage. The ship's 4 turboelectric engines, each driving a massive propeller, churned the Pacific waters into white foam as the carrier began a series of evasive maneuvers. But Sherman knew that no amount of maneuvering could make a ship this large truly nimble. The Lexington displaced 43,000 tons, fully loaded, and her turning radius was measured in nautical miles, not feet. Every decision about course and speed had to be made well in advance, anticipating where enemy aircraft might appear rather than reacting to their actual positions. Fighter Director Officer Lieutenant Paul Ramsey, a 29-year-old graduate of the Naval Academy from Charleston, South Carolina, coordinated the carrier's defensive fighter screen. He had 9 Wildcat fighters already airborne, circling above the task force in a combat air patrol pattern. Through his radio headset, Ramsey directed these fighters to intercept the incoming Japanese formation, giving them vectors and altitude information based on the radar reports still flowing from Morelli's station. The young pilots, most of them barely out of their teens, acknowledged his orders with clipped, professional responses that barely masked their fear and excitement. The Japanese formation, led by Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, consisted of 27 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, called VALs by American forces. These aircraft, with their distinctive fixed landing gear and greenhouse canopies, were specifically designed for the precision attack of naval vessels. Each VAL carried a single 550-pound bomb mounted under its fuselage, and the pilots who flew them had trained for years to perfect the nearly vertical diving attack that made the VAL so deadly against ships. Takahashi, a veteran of the attack on Pearl Harbor and numerous other operations, knew that success depended on overwhelming the carrier's defenses through sheer numbers and coordinated timing. At 11:27, the first Wildcats made contact with the Japanese formation at 15,000 feet. The American fighters, stubby and robust with their distinctive mid-mounted wings, dove into the enemy formation with guns blazing. Ensign John Lepla from Minnesota, flying Wildcat number 17, managed to shoot down 2 VALs in the initial attack, sending them spiraling into the ocean in flames. But there were simply too many enemy aircraft for the 9 Wildcats to stop them all. The Japanese pilots scattered, breaking into smaller groups that approached the carrier from multiple directions simultaneously, a tactic designed to split the defensive fire and increase the chances that at least some bombers would reach their target. Aboard the Lexington, the anti-aircraft gun crews opened fire as soon as the first VALs came within range. The ship mounted 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns and 4 twin turrets, 12 1.1-inch quad mounts, and dozens of smaller caliber weapons. The combined firepower created a wall of exploding shells and tracer fire that filled the sky around the carrier with deadly metal fragments. 20-year-old gunner's mate, second class James Sullivan from Boston, Massachusetts, commanded one of the 5-inch mounts on the port side. The son of a fisherman who had worked the Grand Banks, Sullivan had joined the Navy to escape the declining fishing industry and found himself in a very different kind of dangerous profession. Through his gun sight, Sullivan tracked a VAL as it began its attack dive, the bomber's nose pointing almost straight down as it plummeted toward the carrier at over 300 miles per hour. His crew worked with mechanical precision, loading shells, adjusting aim, and firing in a rhythm they had practiced thousands of times. The 5-inch gun bucked and roared, sending shell after shell toward the diving bomber. Sullivan saw his tracers converge on the aircraft, saw pieces fly off its wing, but the VAL kept coming. At the last possible moment, the Japanese pilot released his bomb and pulled up hard, the aircraft straining against the G-forces as it climbed away from the carrier. The bomb struck the Lexington's flight deck near the port side forward, penetrating through the wooden planking and exploding in a ready room where pilots had been briefing just minutes earlier. The blast killed 11 men instantly and started fires in 3 separate compartments. Damage control parties, led by Chief Petty Officer Michael O'Brien from Philadelphia, rushed toward the scene with hoses and firefighting equipment. O'Brien, a veteran of 22 years in the Navy, had fought fires on ships before, but never while under active attack with bombs still falling around him. The second bomb hit 20 seconds later, striking near the smokestack and sending shrapnel tearing through the ship's superstructure. A piece of hot metal severed a fuel line, and aviation gasoline began pouring into the compartments below. The volatile liquid found its way into the ventilation system, filling spaces throughout the ship with explosive fumes that would prove more dangerous than the bombs themselves. But in those initial minutes, as the attack continued, no one aboard realized just how deadly this fuel leak would become. Commander Morton Seligman, the Lexington's executive officer, coordinated damage control efforts from the central command post deep within the ship. A graduate of Columbia University who had joined the Navy in 1923, Seligman maintained a calm demeanor even as reports of casualties and damage poured in from all sections of the vessel. He directed repair parties to the most critical areas, prioritized which fires to fight first, and kept Captain Sherman informed of the ship's condition. Seligman's ability to process information quickly and make clear decisions under pressure would prove vital in the chaos of battle. Above deck, the attack continued with terrifying intensity. VALs dove from every direction, their bombs whistling through the air before exploding on impact or in the water alongside the carrier. Near misses sent towering columns of water cascading across the flight deck, soaking gun crews and making the already slippery deck even more treacherous. Seaman Walter Krause from rural Kansas, assigned to an ammunition supply team, ran back and forth carrying heavy shells to the gun mounts, his legs burning with exhaustion and his ears ringing from the constant explosions. Krause had grown up on a wheat farm, and the violence of modern naval warfare seemed almost incomprehensible compared to the peaceful plains of his childhood. Lieutenant Charles McCuskey, a dive bomber pilot from Texas who had been in the ready room when the first bomb struck, found himself fighting fires alongside the damage control teams. Despite suffering burns on his hands and face from the initial blast, McCuskey grabbed a fire hose and directed water onto the flames consuming the compartment. The heat was so intense that paint blistered on the metal bulkheads, and smoke made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But McCuskey and the sailors around him kept fighting, knowing that if the fires reached the ammunition magazines or fuel tanks, the entire ship could be destroyed. Fighter Director Ramsey continued to vector Wildcats toward incoming Vals, but the Japanese pilots showed remarkable skill and determination. They had trained for this moment, practicing their diving attacks until they could place their bombs within feet of where they aimed. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, leading from the front, dove through intense anti-aircraft fire to place his bomb directly on the Lexington's flight deck near the island's superstructure. The explosion knocked out several fire control stations and killed 6 men, but Takahashi's aircraft took multiple hits during his pullout and crashed into the sea just beyond the carrier's stern. Ensign Robert Wood from Ohio, piloting one of the defending Wildcats, chased a Val through the maze of anti-aircraft fire, mindful that American shells were just as dangerous to him as they were to the enemy. Wood had grown up in Cleveland, where his father worked in a steel mill, and he had dreamed of being a pilot since childhood. Now, at 22 years old, he found himself in a life-or-death struggle with a skilled enemy pilot who refused to break off his attack run, despite Wood's machine gun fire tearing through his aircraft's tail section. The Val released its bomb, which narrowly missed the Lexington, and exploded in the water close enough to spray the carrier with fragments. Only then did the Japanese bomber finally succumb to its damage, rolling inverted and plunging into the Pacific. By 11:34, just 7 minutes after the attack began, the last Val either dropped its bomb or was shot down. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns fell silent, and an eerie quiet descended over the battle group, broken only by the crackle of fires and the shouts of damage control teams. Of the 27 Vals that had attacked, only 9 managed to return to their carrier. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire had destroyed 18 enemy bombers, a casualty rate of over 66% that shocked Japanese commanders when they received the reports. But the Vals had also achieved their objective. The Lexington had been hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes from a separate torpedo bomber attack that had come in simultaneously at low level, strikes that no one on the bridge had even seen through the chaos of the dive bombing assault. Captain Sherman assessed the damage with growing concern. The ship was listing 7 degrees to port due to flooding from the torpedo hits, and fires burned in multiple locations despite the best efforts of the damage control teams. But the Lexington's engines still functioned, and Sherman believed his ship could survive. He ordered continued efforts to fight the fires and counterflood ballast tanks to correct the list. For the next several hours, the crew worked with desperate energy to save their ship, not knowing that the fuel vapors accumulating below decks were creating a time bomb that no amount of effort could defuse. Commander Seligman moved through the damaged compartments, assessing each fire and directing resources where they were most needed. The executive officer's uniform was soaked with water and streaked with soot, and his face showed the strain of hours spent in smoke-filled spaces where the temperature exceeded 130 degrees. But Seligman never lost his composure, speaking calmly to exhausted sailors and making split-second decisions about which bulkheads to seal and which fires to let burn themselves out in order to save manpower for more critical areas. In the engine rooms, Chief Machinist's mate Harold Thompson from Tennessee kept the carrier's 4 massive turbines running despite the damage around him. Thompson, who had enlisted in 1927, knew these engines better than anyone aboard. He could diagnose problems by the sound they made and had trained his crew to respond instantly to any emergency. When flooding from the torpedo hits threatened to reach the electrical switchboards that controlled the engines, Thompson organized a bucket brigade that kept the water at bay long enough for portable pumps to arrive. His quick thinking and technical expertise kept the Lexington mobile, giving the ship a fighting chance to reach safer waters. At 13:20, more than 2 hours after the attack, an enormous explosion ripped through the carrier's interior. The accumulated fuel vapors had found an ignition source, possibly a spark from damaged electrical equipment or a still-burning ember from the earlier fires. The blast blew out entire bulkheads, killed 25 men instantly, and started new fires that quickly grew out of control. Damage control parties found themselves fighting blazes in compartments they had thought were secure, and the situation deteriorated rapidly. Captain Sherman realized that his ship was dying. Despite everything his crew had done, despite their courage and skill and determination, the Lexington could not be saved. At 14:50, Sherman made the hardest decision of his naval career. He ordered all hands to abandon ship. The announcement came over the ship's public address system in a calm, measured voice that belied the tragedy of the moment. "All hands, this is the captain. We are abandoning ship. Proceed to your designated abandoned ship stations. Do not panic. We have plenty of time. Help your shipmates." The evacuation proceeded with remarkable order. Officers ensured that wounded men reached the lifeboats first, and sailors helped each other over the side into the warm Pacific waters, where destroyers waited to pick them up. Lieutenant McCuskey, still suffering from his earlier burns, made 3 trips back into smoke-filled compartments to ensure no one had been left behind. Chief O'Brien remained aboard until the very end, walking through every space he could reach, calling out to see if anyone needed help. The Philadelphia native finally went over the side at 1747, just minutes before a massive explosion tore through the Lexington's hangar deck. Of the 2,551 men aboard the Lexington that morning, 216 lost their lives. Many died in the initial attack, but others perished in the subsequent explosions and fires that consumed the ship throughout the afternoon. The survivors, picked up by destroyers and other vessels, watched from a distance as their home burned. In 1915, Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding the task force from the Yorktown, ordered the destroyer USS Phelps to sink the Lexington with torpedoes to prevent the Japanese from salvaging the wreck. 5 torpedoes struck the burning carrier, and at 7:52 that evening, the USS Lexington disappeared beneath the waves of the Coral Sea. The 7-minute battle had demonstrated both the incredible striking power of dive bombers when properly employed, and the vulnerability of even the largest aircraft carriers to concentrated air attack. Captain Sherman, who survived the sinking and would go on to command other carriers later in the war, wrote in his after-action report that the speed and ferocity of the dive bombing attack had been unlike anything he had experienced. The Japanese had proven that they could sink an American fleet carrier, but the cost had been staggering. The loss of 18 highly trained pilots and aircrew from a single strike represented a hemorrhage of expertise that Japan could not sustain. For the United States Navy, the loss of the Lexington provided crucial lessons that would shape carrier doctrine for the rest of the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the battle reports extensively and ordered immediate changes to carrier defensive procedures. The most significant was the decision to dramatically increase the number of fighters assigned to carrier air wings. Before Coral Sea, carriers typically embarked 18 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers. After analyzing how the Lexington had been overwhelmed, Nimitz ordered that fighter complements be increased to 36 or more aircraft per carrier, even if it meant reducing the number of strike aircraft. The Navy also invested heavily in improved radar systems and fighter direction capabilities. Lieutenant Ramsey's after-action report, written while recovering from minor wounds aboard the Yorktown, emphasized how the limited number of fighters and the difficulty of coordinating them against multiple attack groups had hampered the defense. His recommendations led to the development of dedicated combat information centers on carriers, spaces equipped with advanced radar displays and communication equipment that allowed fighter directors to track both friendly and enemy aircraft simultaneously and coordinate more effective defenses. Anti-aircraft capabilities also received immediate attention. While the Lexington's guns had shot down several Vals, the 5-inch weapons had proven too slow to track fast-moving dive bombers effectively, and the 1.1-inch guns lacked sufficient hitting power. The Navy accelerated development of 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm Oerlikon cannons, weapons that would eventually equip every carrier in the fleet and prove far more effective against diving aircraft. By 1944, Essex-class carriers would mount more than 100 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers, creating defensive firepower many times greater than what the Lexington had possessed. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond the 216 men who died aboard the Lexington. In Boston, Mary Sullivan received a telegram informing her that her son James had been killed during the action. The young gunner's mate had continued firing his 5-inch mount even after being wounded by shrapnel, remaining at his post until another explosion killed him and his entire gun crew. In Brooklyn, Thomas Morelli's family celebrated when they learned their son had survived, though the young radar operator would struggle with what today we would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder for years after the war ended. Lieutenant Commander Dixon, who had stood on the bridge watching the battle unfold, survived the sinking and later commanded his own carrier. In his memoirs, written decades after the war, Dixon reflected on those 7 minutes that changed everything. He wrote about the incredible bravery of ordinary sailors who had volunteered for service, many of them from small towns and cities across America, who found themselves in circumstances beyond anything they could have imagined. Dixon particularly remembered Chief O'Brien, the Philadelphia firefighter turned sailor who had risked his life repeatedly to ensure no one was left behind on the dying ship. The Battle of the Coral Sea, of which the attack on the Lexington was a central episode, proved to be a strategic victory for the United States despite the tactical losses. The Japanese advance toward Port Moresby was halted, and for the first time in the war, a major Japanese offensive had been turned back. The carrier Shikaku had been damaged, and the Zuikaku had lost most of its air group, preventing both carriers from participating in the Battle of Midway 1 month later. That absence would prove decisive when American carriers surprised and destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers, permanently shifting the balance of naval power in the Pacific. For the survivors of the Lexington, the war continued. Many were reassigned to other ships, taking with them the hard-won lessons learned in the Coral Sea. Ensign Wood, the fighter pilot from Ohio, eventually became an ace with 7 confirmed victories before the war ended. Commander Seligman received command of his own destroyer and earned the Navy Cross for actions in the Solomon Islands campaign. Chief Thompson, the Tennessee machinist who had kept the Lexington's engines running, served aboard 3 more carriers before retiring in 1946 as a commissioned warrant officer. The tactical evolution prompted by the Lexington's loss became evident in subsequent carrier battles. At Midway, improved fighter direction and increased fighter strength allowed American carriers to break up Japanese attack formations before they could deliver coordinated strikes. At the Philippine Sea in 1944, American carriers, with their enhanced anti-aircraft batteries and large fighter complements, decisively defeated a massive Japanese air attack in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, shooting down more than 300 enemy aircraft while suffering minimal damage themselves. Military historians have extensively studied the 7-minute battle that doomed the Lexington, analyzing the decisions made by both American defenders and Japanese attackers. The consensus is that given the technology and tactical doctrine of 1942, the carrier's loss was probably inevitable once the Vals began their attack runs. The dive bomber, when employed by skilled pilots in sufficient numbers, was simply too difficult to stop with the defensive systems available at that point in the war. But the battle also demonstrated that such attacks came at an unsustainable cost to the attackers, particularly in terms of trained aircrew, a lesson that would ultimately favor the United States with its greater capacity to train replacement pilots. Captain Sherman's decision to abandon ship has been praised as an example of leadership under extreme pressure. By waiting until he was certain the Lexington could not be saved but acting before the situation became chaotic, Sherman ensured that the vast majority of his crew survived. His calm demeanor during the evacuation set the tone for the entire operation, preventing the panic that could have led to far greater loss of life. Sherman's after-action reports also provided valuable intelligence about Japanese tactics and capabilities that informed American planning for future battles. The families of those who died on the Lexington, like the families of all war casualties, faced the difficult task of moving forward while honoring the memory of their lost loved ones. In small towns across America, memorial services were held, plaques were placed in courthouses and schools, and mothers displayed gold star flags in their windows. The Sullivan family in Boston gathered photographs and letters from James, preserving the memory of a young man who had volunteered to serve his country and paid the ultimate price. These individual tragedies, multiplied thousands of times across both sides of the conflict, represented the true cost of the strategic decisions made by military and political leaders. The wreck of the USS Lexington remained on the floor of the Coral Sea for 76 years before being discovered by an expedition led by philanthropist Paul Allen in March 2018. The carrier rests at a depth of over 10,000 feet, broken into several large sections but remarkably well preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor water. Images from remotely operated vehicles show gun mounts still in position, aircraft remains on the hangar deck, and personal effects scattered throughout the wreckage. The discovery brought renewed attention to the battle and allowed the Navy to update its records about the ship's final resting place, providing some closure to the families of those who died aboard her. Today, the lessons learned from the USS Lexington's final battle remain relevant to naval strategists. Modern carrier battle groups still emphasize layered defenses, with fighter aircraft providing outer defense, medium-range missiles engaging threats at intermediate distances, and close-in weapon systems serving as a last line of defense. The principle of overwhelming an adversary's defenses through coordinated attacks from multiple directions, which the Japanese employed so effectively in May 1942, continues to drive offensive planning. And the importance of damage control and crew training, which allowed most of the Lexington's crew to survive despite the loss of their ship, remains central to naval doctrine. The 7-minute battle that changed Pacific strategy stands as a testament to the courage of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. From Seaman Morelli at his radar screen to Captain Sherman on the bridge, from gunner's mate Sullivan at his 5-inch mount to Chief O'Brien fighting fires below decks, every man aboard the Lexington faced the test of combat and responded with determination and professionalism. Their actions, both individually and collectively, demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that would eventually lead to Allied victory in the Pacific War. The strategic implications of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese naval planners, confident after their string of victories in the early months of the war, had believed that their superior training and tactics would continue to bring success. The Coral Sea demonstrated that American forces could learn from defeat, adapt their methods, and become increasingly effective adversaries. The evolution of American carrier doctrine after the loss of the Lexington represented exactly the kind of institutional learning that would ultimately prove decisive in the war. For the men who survived the sinking of the Lexington and went on to serve aboard other ships, the memory of those 7 minutes never faded. In reunions held decades after the war, survivors would gather to remember their lost shipmates and reflect on how a single battle had shaped the course of the Pacific War. They spoke of the terror of the attack, the chaos of the fires, and the sadness of watching their ship sink beneath the waves, but they also spoke with pride about how they had fought back, how they had helped each other survive, and how the lessons learned in the Coral Sea had helped save countless lives in later battles. The USS Lexington, Lady Lex, had been more than just a warship. For her crew, she had been home, workplace, and community all at once. The men who served aboard her came from every state in the Union, from big cities and small towns, from wealthy families and poor ones. On the carrier's decks and in her compartments, they had learned to work together, to rely on each other, and to function as a cohesive team capable of operating one of the most complex machines ever built. When the ship went down, she took with her not just metal and machinery, but a community that had been forged in training and tempered in combat. The Japanese pilots who survived the attack on the Lexington also carried the memory of that battle for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews, several spoke of the intensity of the American anti-aircraft fire and the courage of the defending fighter pilots. They acknowledged that while they had succeeded in sinking the carrier, the cost had been staggering. Of the 27 pilots who had taken off that morning, only 9 had returned to their carrier. The loss of 18 aircrew from a single strike represented more than just numbers on a casualty report. These were highly trained professionals whose skills had taken years to develop and could not be quickly replaced. As World War II progressed, the evolution of carrier warfare continued at a rapid pace. The tactics that had proven so deadly at Coral Sea were countered by improved defenses, which in turn prompted new offensive methods. By war's end, carrier operations bore little resemblance to those of 1942, but the fundamental lessons remained constant. The importance of air superiority, the value of coordinated strikes, the necessity of robust defenses, and above all, the crucial role of well-trained, courageous personnel willing to risk their lives in service of their nation. The legacy of the USS Lexington and the 7-minute battle that sealed her fate continues to resonate in military education and planning. At the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, the battle is studied as an example of tactical adaptation and strategic learning. Future carrier commanders analyze the decisions made by Captain Sherman and his officers, examining what worked and what did not, understanding that the lessons paid for with the lives of 216 sailors must be remembered and applied to prevent similar tragedies in future conflicts. For historians studying the Pacific War, the loss of the Lexington represents a pivotal moment when the nature of naval warfare shifted decisively. The age of the battleship had already been ending, though some naval officers were slow to accept this reality. The Coral Sea battle, and particularly the dramatic demonstration of air power's ability to destroy the largest warships, removed any remaining doubt. From May 1942 onward, carriers would be recognized as the capital ships of modern navies, and every aspect of fleet composition and doctrine would be reorganized around protecting and employing these vessels effectively. In the small towns and cities where the Lexington's crew had lived before the war, memorials stand today honoring those who served and those who died. In Portland, a plaque at the local Navy recruiting office commemorates Lieutenant Commander Dixon and other local sailors who served on the carrier. In Boston, the Sullivan family's church maintains a memorial book listing all parishioners who served in World War II, with James Sullivan's name highlighted in gold. These local remembrances, found in communities across America, keep alive the memory of individuals who might otherwise be forgotten in the vast scope of a global conflict that claimed millions of lives. The technical analysis of the battle has provided valuable data for generations of naval architects and weapons designers. The penetrating power of the Japanese bombs, the effectiveness of various calibers of anti-aircraft guns, the vulnerability of aircraft carriers to internal explosions from accumulated fuel vapors, all of these factors inform the design of subsequent carriers. The Essex-class carriers that entered service later in the war incorporated numerous features specifically intended to prevent the kind of cascading failures that had doomed the Lexington, including improved compartmentalization, better damage control equipment, and redesigned ventilation systems to prevent fuel vapor accumulation. The human dimension of the battle, the stories of individual courage and sacrifice, provides perhaps the most enduring legacy. When Chief O'Brien made his final walk through the dying ship, ensuring no one had been left behind, he was acting on principles of leadership and duty that transcend any particular conflict or era. When Gunner's mate Sullivan continued firing his weapon despite his wounds, he was demonstrating a commitment to his shipmates and his mission that represents the highest ideals of military service. These individual acts of heroism, multiplied across the entire crew, transformed what could have been a chaotic disaster into an orderly evacuation that saved thousands of lives. The 7 minutes that changed Pacific strategy began as just another day at war, with sailors performing routine duties aboard a ship in contested waters. It ended with the loss of a fleet carrier and the deaths of more than 200 men. But in between, something remarkable happened. A diverse group of Americans, most of them very young, faced an existential crisis and responded with courage, skill, and determination. They fought their ship with everything they had, and when it became clear she could not be saved, they helped each other abandon her in an orderly fashion that minimized casualties. In doing so, they provided an example of leadership, teamwork, and resilience that continues to inspire military personnel and civilians alike more than 80 years after the battle took place. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw survivors struggling with a range of emotions that would take years to process. Seaman Morelli, the young radar operator from Brooklyn, found himself aboard the destroyer USS Hammond, wrapped in a borrowed blanket and drinking hot coffee despite the tropical heat. Around him, other survivors sat in small groups, some talking quietly about what had happened, others staring silently at the horizon where their ship had disappeared. Morelli kept replaying those first radar contacts in his mind, wondering if he could have reported them sooner, if somehow he could have given the fighters more time to intercept the Japanese bombers. It was a guilt that many survivors would carry, despite the irrationality of it, despite knowing they had done everything possible. Lieutenant McCuskey, the Texas pilot who had fought fires despite his burns, required weeks of medical treatment for his injuries. The burns on his hands healed slowly, leaving scars that he would carry for the rest of his life, but the physical scars were minor compared to the psychological impact of losing so many friends and shipmates in a single afternoon. McCuskey attended memorial services for his squadron mates, stood at attention as the names of the dead were read, and struggled to find words of comfort for the families who wrote to him asking about their son's final moments. Like many combat veterans, he found it difficult to explain what battle was really like to people who had never experienced it, the confusion and terror mixed with moments of extraordinary clarity and purpose. Commander Seligman's detailed reports on damage control procedures aboard the Lexington became required reading at naval training schools. His methodical documentation of what worked and what did not, written with clinical precision despite his personal loss and exhaustion, provided invaluable guidance for future damage control officers. Seligman described in technical detail how the fuel vapor accumulation had occurred, explaining the chain of events that had transformed manageable damage into a catastrophic situation. He recommended specific changes to carrier ventilation systems, fuel line routing, and damage control protocols that were implemented across the fleet. His work likely saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives on other carriers that were damaged in subsequent battles. The families left behind faced their own difficult journeys. Mary Sullivan, James' mother, maintained her son's room exactly as he had left it for years after receiving the telegram announcing his death. She would sit in that room sometimes, holding the letters he had sent home, reading about his shipmates and his duties and his hopes for after the war. The Sullivan family, like thousands of other families across America, learned to carry their grief while continuing with daily life, supporting the war effort even as they mourned their personal loss. Mary volunteered with the Red Cross, rolled bandages, and organized scrap metal drives, channeling her pain into action that might help bring other sons home safely. In Japan, the families of the 18 VAL pilots who did not return also grieved. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi's widow received his personal effects and a brief letter describing his death in battle. The Japanese military culture emphasized honor and sacrifice, but that cultural framework could not entirely shield families from the pain of loss. Takahashi had been a career naval officer, a veteran of China and Pearl Harbor, a man whose skill and experience were irreplaceable to the Japanese Navy. His death, and the deaths of 17 other trained pilots in a single attack, represented a hemorrhage of expertise that Japan's pilot training programs could not stanch. The strategic ramifications of the Coral Sea battle, and specifically the damage inflicted during those 7 minutes of dive bombing, extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Admiral Nimitz, analyzing the battle reports at his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, recognized that the loss of the Lexington had been offset by the prevention of a Japanese landing at Port Moresby. The strategic position of Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea would have threatened Australia and given Japan a forward base for further operations. By preventing its capture, even at the cost of a fleet carrier, the Battle of Coral Sea had achieved its primary objective. But Nimitz also understood that the Navy could not afford to lose carriers at this rate. In May 1942, the United States had only 4 fleet carriers operational in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, and the now-sunk Lexington. The Saratoga, Lexington's sister ship, was undergoing repairs in the United States after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in January. New Essex-class carriers were under construction, but none would be ready for combat until late 1943 at the earliest. Every carrier loss was a catastrophic blow to American naval capabilities, and Nimitz knew that further losses could cede control of the Pacific to Japan for years. This understanding drove Nimitz's emphasis on learning from the Lexington's loss. He convened a board of inquiry that examined every aspect of the battle, from the initial radar detection to the final abandoned ship order. The board interviewed survivors, studied damage reports, and analyzed Japanese tactics. The recommendations were sweeping: more fighters per carrier, improved radar systems, better fighter direction capabilities, enhanced anti-aircraft armament, modified damage control procedures, and changes to carrier design that would make ships more resistant to the kind of cascading failures that had doomed the Lexington. The implementation of these recommendations occurred with remarkable speed. Carriers under construction had their designs modified before launching. Ships already in service underwent modifications during yard periods, with new radar systems installed and additional anti-aircraft guns mounted wherever space could be found. The Navy established advanced training schools for fighter directors, teaching them how to coordinate multiple fighter divisions against coordinated enemy attacks. These changes, born from the hard lessons of the Coral Sea, would prove their worth at Midway just 1 month later. At Midway, the improved fighter direction and increased fighter strength allowed American carriers to break up Japanese attack formations before they could deliver coordinated strikes. When Japanese dive bombers attacked the Yorktown, the carriers' enhanced defenses shot down most of the attackers before they could release their bombs. Although the Yorktown was eventually sunk, she survived far longer than she would have under the defensive arrangements that had been in place at Coral Sea. The Enterprise and Hornet, employing the lessons learned from the Lexington's loss, successfully defended themselves while launching the strikes that destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers. The human stories from the Lexington continued to unfold in the years following the battle. Ensign Wood, the fighter pilot from Ohio, became an instructor at a naval air station in Florida, teaching new pilots the tactics he had learned in combat. He found the work frustrating at times, watching young men fresh from training struggle with concepts that seemed obvious to him but had only become clear through the crucible of actual combat. Wood tried to convey not just the technical aspects of fighter tactics, but the psychological reality of combat, the fear and adrenaline and split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between life and death. Chief Thompson, the machinist from Tennessee, transferred to the new carrier Essex when she was commissioned in December 1942. He brought with him not just technical expertise, but institutional memory, an understanding of how carrier engineering plants operated under combat conditions that could not be learned from manuals or training exercises. Thompson trained younger machinists, passing on the knowledge he had gained through years of experience and the hard lessons of the Coral Sea. His protégés would serve on carriers throughout the Pacific, and many would credit Thompson with teaching them the skills that saved their ships when damage threatened engineering spaces. The destroyer crews who had picked up survivors from the Lexington also carried the memory of that day. Sailors aboard the USS Hammond, which had rescued over 400 survivors, including Seaman Morelli, spoke of the haunted look in the eyes of the men they pulled from the water. Many survivors had been in the water for hours, covered in oil, exhausted from swimming away from the sinking carrier. Some were injured, with burns or shrapnel wounds that needed immediate treatment. Others were physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered by the experience of losing their ship and watching shipmates die. The destroyer crews did what they could, providing blankets, hot food, medical care, and a listening ear for men who needed to talk about what they had experienced. Tragically, the Hammond herself would be sunk just 1 month later at Midway, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine while assisting the damaged Yorktown. Many of the same sailors who had rescued Lexington survivors found themselves in the water, now needing rescue themselves. Seaman Morelli, who had transferred to another ship by that time, learned of the Hammond's loss with deep sadness. The ship and crew that had saved him were gone, and he felt a profound sense of loss and survivors' guilt that would take years of reflection to process. The documentary evidence left by the battle provides historians with a detailed picture of what occurred during those 7 minutes and the hours that followed. Captain Sherman's action report, written with careful attention to detail despite the emotional impact of losing his command, offers a minute-by-minute account of the battle. Sherman described the courage of his crew, the effectiveness of various defensive measures, and the chain of events that led to the ship's loss. His report, free from self-justification or blame, became a model for how officers should document combat actions, providing information that would be useful for future commanders while honoring the sacrifice of those who had fought and died. Lieutenant Commander Dixon's personal journal, donated to the Naval War College after his death in 1983, provides additional insight into the battle. Dixon wrote with raw honesty about his fear during the attack, his admiration for the sailors who had maintained their posts despite overwhelming danger, and his grief over the losses. He described watching 18-year-old sailors operating anti-aircraft guns with hands that shook from adrenaline, maintaining their discipline even as bombs exploded around them. Dixon noted the contrast between the chaos of combat and the eerie silence that followed, broken only by the sound of damage control teams fighting fires and the moans of wounded men awaiting medical attention. The medical challenges presented by the battle tested the limits of naval medicine in 1942. The Lexington's medical department, led by Commander Arthur White from Philadelphia, treated more than 60 seriously wounded men during and after the attack. Working in cramped, smoke-filled compartments with limited supplies and no possibility of evacuating patients, the medical staff performed minor surgeries, treated burns, stopped bleeding, and provided pain relief to wounded sailors. Commander White continued treating patients even after the abandoned shipboarder, ensuring that all wounded men reached the lifeboats before he himself left the ship. His dedication to his patients, at great personal risk, exemplified the best traditions of military medicine. The wounded survivors faced long recoveries aboard hospital ships and at naval hospitals in Pearl Harbor and on the West Coast. Lieutenant McCuskey spent 6 weeks at the Naval Hospital in San Diego, undergoing painful skin grafts for his burns and physical therapy to restore function to his scarred hands. The hospital ward where he recovered held dozens of other Lexington survivors, and the bonds formed during that time would last for decades. These men had shared an experience that set them apart, an ordeal that only they truly understood. They spoke a common language of shared trauma and survival, finding comfort in each other's company that they could not find elsewhere. The propaganda value of the battle was recognized by both sides. The Japanese initially claimed to have sunk 2 American carriers at Coral Sea, exaggerating their success for morale purposes. Japanese newspapers published triumphant accounts of the battle, emphasizing the skill of their pilots and the weakness of American defenses. These reports boosted civilian morale in Japan, but also created unrealistic expectations about how the war would progress. When subsequent battles did not produce similar overwhelming victories, the Japanese public began to question the official narratives they had been told. In the United States, the loss of the Lexington was initially kept secret, with news of the battle delayed for several weeks to prevent Japan from gaining intelligence about American losses. When the sinking was finally announced, the Navy emphasized the heroism of the crew and the strategic success of preventing the Port Moresby landing. Newspapers across America carried stories about the battle, with headlines praising the sacrifice of the Lexington's crew. Families of the deceased received telegrams, and memorial services were held in communities from coast to coast. The battle brought home the reality of war to Americans who had previously experienced it only through newsreels and newspaper reports. The technological legacy of the battle extended beyond immediate tactical changes. The experience of the Lexington's loss influenced the development of new materials and construction techniques for subsequent carriers. Designers recognized that the combination of aviation fuel and enclosed spaces created an inherent vulnerability that needed to be addressed through better compartmentalization and improved ventilation systems. The Essex-class carriers incorporated armored flight decks in their designs, though budget constraints and weight limitations meant that American carriers never achieved the level of protection that British carriers possessed. The trade-off was that American carriers could operate larger air groups, emphasizing offense over defense and carrier design philosophy. The loss also spurred development of improved firefighting equipment and techniques. The Navy established damage control schools where sailors learned to fight fires, repair structural damage, and manage flooding in realistic training facilities. These schools used mock-ups of carrier compartments where trainees experienced smoke-filled spaces, practiced using firefighting equipment under pressure, and learned to work as teams in crisis situations. The training was demanding and sometimes dangerous, but it prepared sailors for the conditions they would face in combat far better than classroom instruction could. Looking back from the perspective of 8 decades, the 7-minute battle that doomed the USS Lexington stands as a watershed moment in naval history. The attack demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers, despite their size and power, were vulnerable to concentrated air attack. But it also showed that carriers with proper defenses and tactics could survive such attacks, as the Yorktown would demonstrate at Midway. The balance between offensive striking power and defensive capability became the central question of carrier design and operations, a question that navies continue to grapple with in the 21st century. The story of the USS Lexington and her final battle serves as a reminder of the cost of freedom and the price paid by those who serve in uniform. It illustrates how military organizations learn and adapt, turning tactical defeats into strategic advantages through analysis and innovation. And it honors the memory of ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet the challenge, sacrificing everything so that others might live and their nation might prevail. In 7 minutes of intense combat on a May morning in 1942, the future of naval warfare was written in fire and smoke above the Coral Sea, and the lessons learned would echo through every carrier battle that followed until the war's end 3 years later. The men who fought that battle, both those who survived and those who did not, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a historical record, but as individuals who faced the ultimate test of courage and did not falter. Their legacy lives on in the modern Navy, in the tactics and procedures that trace their origins to that desperate afternoon in the Coral Sea, and in the freedom secured by their sacrifice.